Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 25th day of January. It is a Wednesday. It is an absolutely gorgeous day today. I think it's a one-day thing, but we're in for some weather again tomorrow. And we did have weather the last couple of days. But today is absolutely gorgeous. It is clear. It is sunny. It is not bitter cold. It's a wonderful day. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here again today on this our third day. But again, I did miss the program on Monday, but at least we're able to do the two programs we've been responsible for here this week. So I'm really excited about that. I do invite you to participate actively in our program. There's so much going on. There's so much to talk about. It's almost impossible to organize it into any coherent. I mean, there is everything. We'll talk about a little bit about this, but I do invite you to participate and share your thoughts. And I know everybody has thoughts. My heavens, everybody that we talk to, everybody that I talk to, immediately goes to this particular subject, and so I know people have things to say and thoughts and concerns and hopes and fears and all the rest of it. I guess what I would like to assure you of is that our listeners will welcome your comments or your ideas. And the phone number that we have available for you is available just so that kind of thing can happen. So we do invite you, I do encourage you to feel free to share your thoughts and your ideas and your concerns with our other listeners as well as with me, because we would all love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to email me directly, if you're a little bit uncomfortable or reluctant about going on the air, but at the same time you'd like to get your thoughts on record and trust me to do the best I can to present your thoughts for you, then by all means feel free to drop me an email. My email address is WAObrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. That's WAObrien 906 @gmail.com. And again, I do remind you to visit our Facebook page. There are a number of postings on there. In fact, there's one that I put on there this morning that I imagine at some point in today's program we'll be touching upon as well, because it's a major one. It deals with the whole issue of freedom of the press. And I put the link to the particular article I was talking about on Facebook a little bit earlier today, along with a few comments of my own about it. And I'd like to address that issue because I think it's so important. If you are a user of Facebook, you know how easy it is to gain access to our Facebook page. Just go to the homepage, and in the search box at the top, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be onto our Facebook page. And the most recent posting there is the one I made reference to that I put on there earlier today. And then the other most recent postings follow in order, in descending order, with the most recent one first. They are there not only for your information, but also to give you an opportunity to share your thoughts or to react to a lot of these things, because in many cases they're provocative, they raise questions, and they elaborate on issues that I think all of us need to know. And that's kind of the assumption of our Facebook page, that the people who go to it do indeed have a desire to know and are interested in these kinds of subjects. My feeling is if I can present the material or the information in such a way that it sparks your attention and maybe causes you to delve a little bit deeper, then that's really the purpose of the Virtual Center itself, is to develop a greater appreciation for not only for the Constitution, but for the ideals and principles on which it was based and the goals and intent it was designed to fulfill, and to perhaps end up with a much greater respect for the work of the founders by appreciating even more than you do going in what they have accomplished, how they accomplished it, and what the potential of what they accomplished is for the future. And if there's one theme that really has been kind of rearing its head every once in a while over the last several months, it's a concern that I have that the system the founders created is really not up to the challenges that it's facing now. My feeling is that we are beginning to pay the price as a society for some of the obstructionism that we've run into over the last several, I was going to say months, but it's actually in recent years. And that is the debate between originalism and the idea of a living constitution. Because the reality is that the Constitution over the last couple of years has really not been able to address some of the most meaningful changes, meaningful things happening in society. And if you go all the way back to the founders, and Madison especially addresses this issue, absolutely critical that the Constitution change periodically, be changed periodically, in order to meet changing circumstances and thereby remain relevant. Jefferson talked about that. Madison talked about it as well. And so the implication is that we must be willing to accurately assess the kinds of changes and challenges that are happening in society and make certain that the Constitution is up to addressing those. And over the last few years, those kinds of changes, that kind of attitude, the whole idea of the validity and the need for change in order to meet changing circumstances has been challenged, and challenged somewhat successfully. And the result is that many of the changes and many of the issues that we're dealing with today that I believe really confront the very essence of our constitutional republic really are in need of serious analysis in order to meet the challenges they pose. But the willingness to work together to do those things is not there. I think the degree of partisanship and the inability of constituents and groups to get along and to talk constructively and to meet constructively has been damaged. And I think it's taking its toll on the vitality of the Constitution itself. And that really kind of concerns me. One of the issues that we'll be dealing with today is this whole question of freedom of the press. We've talked about it over the last couple of programs, made reference to it, and indeed talked about it a bit. But the fact of the matter is the implications as to the seriousness of this conversation, I don't think we've adequately addressed. The reason that freedom of the press is even in the First Amendment, what it was there to accomplish, why it's necessary in order to accomplish what this republic stands for, and thereby trying to get a handle on what the real issues associated with this hostility that has emerged between the new president and the media, and how serious that is in terms of the implications for the nature, for the republic and for its future. So I think these are the kinds of things that I think are very necessary. It almost requires a degree of depth that becomes very difficult when so many things are happening simultaneously. So many significant questions related to constitutionalism itself are on the table within the last week. Many of you know one of the issues that I did want to spend a little bit of time on today, I actually thought that we would get to it yesterday, but we didn't, is the suit, the legal suit that was filed on Monday, alleging that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, is in violation of the Constitution, of the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. In fact, the very minute that he took the oath of office and was sworn in as president, he was in violation of the Constitution of the United States because he hadn't done what is necessary to be done in order to separate his personal and private affairs from the nation's affairs that he became responsible for with the oath of office. And I think we want to talk about that. That is an issue of constitutionalism. The issue on the table just today, one of the big issues, is the resurrection of an item that really hasn't been there for a few days, but it's back today, and that's the issue of the wall at our southern border. And according to the media today, and I don't know whether this has already happened or it's scheduled to happen this afternoon, but at least as of this morning, the media was reporting that the president's intent at some point during the day today, and this is the product of one of his tweets, so-called, was to do what is necessary to move the money in order to begin the process for constructing the wall. And you'll remember that all through the campaign, of course, candidate Trump talked about the fact that we were going to build the wall and that Mexico was going to pay for it. And then at the last minute, and this has pretty much been nailed down since the election itself, Mr. Trump changed a little bit and acknowledged that the money to build a wall wouldn't come directly from Mexico, that what was probably going to happen is that we would have to supply the revenue, public money, to build the wall and get reimbursed by Mexico. And as of this morning, there are efforts underway to set up the meeting between the Trump administration and the Mexican government, dealing principally with trade and elements related to NAFTA and all the rest of it. But there's no question that one of the issues that's going to be on the table is the issue of the wall. But again, there is a serious question of the constitutionality of what the president is proposing. He is talking about taking money that has been appropriated for one purpose, for whatever the purpose was, and moving it in order that it can be used to begin the construction of the wall. Well, according to the Constitution of the United States, the president does not have the authority to change the purposes for which public money was appropriated by Congress. Only Congress has that authority. Now, the reality is, of course, that if push comes to shove, there's every likelihood that this Congress, controlled both houses by Republicans, would make the changes necessary to avoid a constitutional crisis over this. But the fact of the matter is, the way the Constitution is written now, it is Congress that appropriates money. And so if money has been appropriated for a particular purpose, the president doesn't have the right to take that money and use it for something else other than what it was appropriated to do. That would be a violation of the separation of powers. That raises a constitutional issue. The other issue that comes up today are directives or actions by the president related to Guantanamo. And the speculation is that what the president intends to do is resurrect the idea of interrogation that existed at Guantanamo prior to the Obama administration in 2009. One of the first steps that President Obama did was to shut down this interrogation program, which was secret, which was behind closed doors, which, at least in theory, would not or did not violate human rights, but in reality, it was becoming clear that it did. And President Obama terminated that program. And according to what's coming out of Washington today, President Trump is at least moving in the direction of resurrecting that program, with the caveat, of course, that torture would not be allowed, would not be included in this. So President Obama's efforts, commitment, and unsuccessful efforts to close Guantanamo mean that it is still there and it is still available for activities that might violate human rights. The fact of the matter is, and this is what I think makes a program like this so difficult, is that the issues are so many. There's such a variety of serious issues coming up almost daily. And the fact of the matter is, we're not talking about one issue per day. We're talking about several issues coming up each day. And the fact of the matter is, you don't know where to go because there's so many things to deal with, so many issues to cover. It seems at some point, not only we're going to have to find a way here, but others are going to have to find a way as well to kind of stand back and find ways to connect all of these things and to get at the heart and substance of what's going on. At this point, clearly, all the initiative that exists is coming out of the White House. We don't hear much coming from Democrats. We don't hear much coming from Republicans either. Most of what's happening so far are these executive orders being signed by the president. And I think it's very interesting because we recall that Republicans were extremely open and public about their condemnation of President Obama's use of executive orders. Now, of course, the argument against that comment would be that these executive orders, in most cases, are merely designed to negate those approved or written, orders issued by President Obama. But be that as it may, it just seems to me that the very variety, not only of issues themselves, but the seriousness of these issues, the fact that so many issues related to the Constitution of the United States are coming up at the same time, what it suggests is that the new president doesn't seem to be sensitive to or have sufficient respect for the sanctity of the Constitution, I believe. It doesn't seem that the president is even aware of the degree to which some of the things he proposes to do raise serious issues related to the Constitution and are going to be issues that not only Congress but the courts are going to have to deal with. And of course, the other thing that has come up as of just yesterday was the presidential announcement that he would be naming a nominee for the vacant Supreme Court case within the next week. And yesterday he proposed to put out 3 names You'll remember that some months ago during the early part of the campaign, he put out a list of about 20 possible candidates for nomination to a Trump Supreme Court. This week, he has reduced that list to 3. And he put out the list. I had the names on an article. There was an article that appeared in the Washington Post this morning, naming and giving you a little bit of the background of each of the 3. But the fact of the matter is, it's important to realize that this is a seat that President Obama was not permitted to fill. So there are many people who believe that this nomination is one that was stolen because Obama was not permitted to carry through with his constitutional duty. So there's a violation of the Constitution that went unaddressed and continues to go unaddressed. I think what we're seeing here is the danger of this kind of thing. That in so many ways, things that are happening raise issues of constitutionalism. And the fact of the matter is that when they aren't challenged, when they aren't being addressed, you are indeed laying or establishing a precedent for the fact that the Constitution really isn't the law of the land, really doesn't dictate what government can and cannot do. And when you ignore its limitations, its restrictions, and its provisions, and just move as if they didn't even exist, you are doing serious damage to the Constitution of the United States, and that's really what this program, what the Virtual Center is all about, is to validate the significance of the Constitution and to reiterate and to strengthen appreciation for the fact that this is a constitutional republic and that as such there are certain critical requirements that must be met in order for this republic to function the way it was designed to be function, the way it was designed to operate. These kinds of things seem to be being pushed aside, brushed aside, as being secondary and unimportant. And the fact of the matter is the nature of the general population it seems to be in a state of cathartic arrest, where people are just kind of standing back and looking at each other in horror as many of these things are happening. And of course, we realize that there are a lot of people, because let's face it, Mr. Trump was elected president of the United States. There are a lot of people that don't feel this way, although more and more of them are surfacing to say that while they voted for Mr. Trump, they didn't really vote for all the kinds of things that are happening. Some of the things that are happening are beginning to disturb them. Many people are becoming concerned. A major one of those being the Affordable Care Act and what's liable to happen. The other thing, one of the other things that occurred in the first few days of the Trump presidency were changes in the process for buying a home, which costs the average home buyer an additional fee that wasn't there before. And the president's promise to corporate leaders that they are going to see a tax cut and they are going to see a reduction in regulations. That's one they've been asking for so long. And we're already beginning to see that the stock market is reacting and responding to these kind of pronouncements coming out of the White House. I think what we're going to find is a lot of people who voted for this president didn't really vote for many of the things that are happening, because so many things are happening. that it's incredible. And the only person that seems to be privy to what's happening and why it's happening and what's likely to happen next is the man who sits in the Oval Office. And I think this is a real issue. Basically, I've been talking from the perspective of putting a program like our virtual center programming on a daily basis together, and how difficult it is to deal with so many issues going on at the same time. I'm struck by the fact that our friend Tom Friedman in this morning's New York Times published his regular piece, and he basically said pretty much the same thing, although I think his way of expressing it perhaps is a little bit more poetic and astute than mine. I'm just giving you the first couple of lines from Tom Friedman's article today, because I really do believe it's an important one. But the date line for this article is London. This article was submitted for publication to the New York Times from London. And Mr. Friedman says, to open his article, I've actually been watching the early Trump presidency from London. And then in parentheses, he said, I would have gone to the moon, but I couldn't get a ride. Even from here, he said, I have vertigo. My head is swirling from alternative facts, trade deals canceled, pipelines initiated, Obamacare in the twilight zone, and utterly bizarre rants about attendance on Inauguration Day and fake voters on Election Day. Whatever this cost Vladimir Putin, he's already gotten his money's worth. A chaos president. Pass the vodka. Unquote. So again, if you, and obviously Tom Friedman does, if you believe that President Putin's hope with a Trump victory was chaos in the White House, chaos in Washington, it's happening. And Friedman's position, of course, is that really plays right into the hands of Vladimir Putin. And I won't get into the rest of the article today, but what Friedman really is talking about in his piece today is, what do Democrats do in response to this? How do Democrats respond to the chaos that seems to be the initial days of this presidency? Traditionally, historians have focused on a panorama of acts that happen in new administrations at the beginning, the first 100 days. There are books written about the first 100 days of FDR's administration prior to the emergence of the New Deal. And there are studies similar to that on other presidents coming into office, because the general impression has always been that new administrations, new presidents, benefit from what usually is called a honeymoon, where most people are willing to stand back and let newly elected administrations do their thing for a while. And so the thinking is that the first 100 days, the first 3 months or so of an administration are critical, because that's the point at which you are most free to initiate or to propose programs and policies and get less feedback or less blowback from it. Even though there are people that might be upset about it, they're not going to take you on right at the beginning of the administration. But in this administration, we're seeing things totally different from that tradition. What we're seeing is that in less than the first week of this presidency, we've seen so many things happening in so many different areas all at once. And that's what Friedman refers to. that you just kind of watch in stunned amazement because nobody seems to be saying anything or doing anything. We really don't know at this point what the rest of government, of national government, thinks or believes about any of this. The media is not telling us because the media has been too focused on its relationship with this president. And this president has made sure that the media doesn't have time or the inclination to focus on anything else except its relationship with him. Right now, during the first 5 days, today's Wednesday, so with the inauguration last Friday, that means that we've had 5 days of this administration. This is the 6th day. And up to this point, all of the action, all of the activity in Washington has revolved around the White House and has revolved around the media's relationship to the White House. And the rest of government has been invisible. With the exception of the Women's March last Saturday, the voting public, the general public, has been silent. But when you look at what happened last Saturday, the public is quite upset. But so far, the public really hasn't been provided an avenue to express itself other than the protest marches of last Saturday. But yesterday we talked here at the Virtual Center about the degree to which President Trump's kerfuffle with the media was successful in taking away the focus of Saturday's Women's March. And as one author pointed out or commented, it reduced the Women's March, as successful as it was, into here today, gone tomorrow. Because the media's attention immediately moved with the end of the marches back to its own relationship with the presidency, with the new president. That has political advantages for the president. He is the news. With few exceptions, if you go to the homepage of any of our major newspapers, you'll find that 4 out of every 5 stories, lead stories, relate to something that happened in or came out of the White House. There seems almost to be nothing else happening in Washington but what the White House initiates. That makes it very difficult to comment and to get into depth on any of these issues because they're coming so fast. But it also works to the advantage of the administration in terms of blunting or making very difficult the opportunity to challenge anything, because before you can get yourself organized to issue a challenge, something else happens which diverts your attention to the next thing. Literally, then, our separation of powers and checks and balances system has been put back on its heels. It's almost like a quarterback in football, where the rush of the defense and its ability, the defense's ability to get into the backfield quickly, has become such an issue that quarterbacks are throwing off their heels, and consequently the passing game is not very effective. The initiative, so-called Big Mo, the motivation, is all on one side. And the rest of government's apparatus is speechless. I really believe that this is not a healthy, positive situation for the Constitution or for the nation. I think if I can be kind of personal for a moment, I think this kind of a situation speaks volumes about the need for the kind of programming like not only this one, but the programs that are regularly featured here at the Head On Radio Network. I think more than ever before, this kind of a voice is necessary. It's going to take time for the arguments and points being presented to take hold. I think you have a constituency. We have a constituency. The Horn has a constituency, which is very strong and very capable, but ultimately not very large. And its effect is going to be determined by its ability to extend and expand its outreach. And that takes time. This is happening fast. The things that are coming out of Washington right now are happening rapidly. And it's going to take time. But the fact of the matter is, it's critical that this position, these kinds of critical, incisive commentary and analysis continue to flourish, continue to be out there. Because once it stops, then people focus all their attention on what's happening rather than the ability to react to it. The issues at hand. We've already mentioned one that I did want to mention because it's extremely important. And it is the lawsuit that was filed on Monday. One of the attorneys, there are a number of prominent attorneys, legal minds, who are advising and helping to formulate this particular lawsuit. The group that filed this suit, the plaintiff, in other words, is a group called Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. The acronym CREW, C-R-E-W, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. It is being advised by a team of legal minds, a team of law professors and government ethics experts. The suit does not seek monetary damages. Rather, it is asking a federal court in New York to order President Trump to stop taking payments from foreign government entities, which clearly violates the emolument clause of the Constitution. At the time of the Constitution, the insertion of the emoluments clause was based on a concern that major European powers would use their military and financial strength to influence government officers in this new fledgling government emerging in America. And the thinking was that it was very essential to make sure that the President of the United States was not economically involved with foreign countries which could initiate things which could harm the future of the evolving republic. Basically, then, the emoluments clause made it illegal for the presidents to receive any kind of retribution from foreign governments at all. What this lawsuit seeks to do is force Donald Trump to stop taking these payments from foreign government entities. They're obviously not direct payments. The governments aren't writing checks to the President of the United States. These include such things as patrons who lease or rent rooms in Trump's hotels and golf courses, loans to finance his office buildings from banks that are often controlled by foreign governments, banks of countries, officially government banks, that are putting up the money and loaning it to Trump's businesses to construct his office buildings. Also, tenants who lease space in many of his buildings. For example, the example that's given in this article out of the Washington Post called The Plum. It's written by Paul Waldman. He points out, for example, that the tourism office at Abu Dhabi is a government enterprise. It is leasing office space in a Trump building. Clearly, it's not possible to know how successful this lawsuit is going to be. One of the key issues about it, and this goes back to the basic legal system itself, is that in order to succeed in a lawsuit, in any lawsuit, the plaintiff must be able to prove personal harm. You've got to be able to prove that the activities that you are alleging are wrong, that violate the law, in this case the Constitution, harm you, not just harm the nation or the world, but harm you personally. And the thinking is that that issue is going to be the one that attorneys defending Trump enterprises are going to use in their defense. That this group, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, doesn't even have the legal standing to file the suit because it can't prove personal harm. But the fact of the matter is, the attorneys who are really advising the litigators in this suit believe that they have covered that base. I saw an interview last week, I believe, over the weekend, that featured Lawrence Tribe from Harvard, who's one of the attorneys involved. And he addressed the specific question of personal harm and therefore the legal right to file the suit. And his sense is this group, it will indeed be able to prove that it is being directly harmed by the activities that the suit is designed to halt. There's one other factor that is associated with this suit. The litigant, the plaintiff, is not seeking cash, is not seeking financial retribution. What the group is seeking is financial relief. And a benefit of this particular suit becoming successful is that it would result in a court order requiring the president to make his tax returns public. There's no question that that objective is a key goal of this lawsuit, because it's becoming very clear that the president will not release his tax returns unless he's forced to do so. And a court order would do that. And the thinking is that this particular lawsuit would produce the court order that made that happen. That's essentially the thinking. It's becoming very clear, and I'm not going to go back through all of this issue of releasing the tax returns, but there's absolutely no question that barring a court order to do so, Mr. Trump is not going to release these returns. In fact, he's made clear himself. Kellyanne Conway, his spokesperson, has made clear as well. On ABC's This Week, Kellyanne Conway spoke about a petition on the White House website calling for Trump to release his returns. Her response to that survey, to that request, on This Week on ABC is the following. The White House response is that he's not going to release his tax returns. We litigated this all through the election. People didn't care. They voted for him, so there you have it. The mere fact that the people elected Trump, even though the tax returns weren't released, is now being used as a defense against demands for the release of those tax returns. If the people cared enough about those returns, they wouldn't have elected Donald Trump. That's the position that's being taken. But that was earlier. Yesterday morning, Kellyanne Conway was on television again. And once again, the issue of tax returns came up. Her response, the president is being audited and will not release his tax returns until the audit is completed. And the fact of the matter is, we know that argument's bogus because others being audited have released tax returns in the past. The IRS has specifically given Mr. Trump permission to release these tax returns, even though there's an audit going on. And the fact of the matter is, we're not even sure, Paul Waldman says, whether in fact there's an audit going on at all. Trump has never produced a letter from IRS proving that he's under audit. He said he is, but he's never produced any evidence that he is. So it's very clear, just in the way they've gone back and forth, defending the non-release of tax returns, that there clearly is a decision to not release those returns. And you have to be pretty shallow in order to not speculate as to why. If those tax returns were positive, if they were going to show evidence, proof, that the president's position on not having any financial dealings in Russia, of making major contributions to charities and other groups, and all the things that he's alleged he has done, if the tax returns were going to validate that, then he wouldn't have any issue about the tax returns at all. The fact that every other president has released their returns has been a problem. His refusal to do so indicates that there's information in those tax returns that he would find uncomfortable, to say the least. Thus, the lawsuit. Paul Waldman points out that the president's defense is the idea of transferring the ownership of his companies and becoming not active in the management of his companies, but letting his sons do it. And his feeling is that meets the requirements of the law. And of course, there's serious questions as to whether it does. Paul Waldman points out that in order to transfer ownership of his biggest companies, Trump would have to file a long list of documents in Florida, Delaware, and New York. Waldman says, we asked officials in each of those states whether they've received the paperwork for that transfer of ownership. As of 3:15 p.m. yesterday afternoon, officials in all 3 states said that they had not received such paperwork. So the president is claiming that the process for transferring his ownership of his companies is underway. But the fact of the matter is it's not. So when you add all of this together, you have to come to the conclusion that barring a court order requiring release of his tax returns, President Trump will not release them. So that seems to me to create a public interest issue in support of this lawsuit. But again, the question of how successful it is going to come down to the challenge as to whether this group has met the legal requirements necessary to even file the suit at all. You remember, if you go all the way back to the John Marshall decision in Marbury versus Madison in 1803, the decision in that case was that Mr. Marbury indeed was entitled to the appointment to the federal office that James Madison had promised him. But that the law, the federal law, which created the requirement that the appointment be made, was not legal. In other words, Marbury did not have sufficient standing to even file the suit. So therefore, he was denied the appointment. Even though he could prove that it was promised to him, he filed suit in federal court. And the Supreme Court's argument is that he did not have the standing to even file the suit, to make it legal. Therefore, the court couldn't find in his favor, even though outside the realm of legal ethics, he had the right to the victory, to the win. But the law that required his appointment was unconstitutional. And if you remember, the textbook tells us that was John Marshall's victory because it basically established the right of the Supreme Court to rule on the constitutionality of legislation, of federal legislation. And so that became a precedent for future litigation and on the part of the Supreme Court, decisions, constitutional decisions on the part of the Supreme Court. That's essentially the same issue, it seems to me, that we're dealing with here. And I think it's an important one. So I think one thing all of us need to watch is the progress of that legal action. But again, the issue of delay, I think, is a very real one. So that's one particular issue that I think is significant. Another one, this one we talked about yesterday. This was an article that we made reference to by a long-term conservative Republican who refused during the campaign to support the candidacy of Donald Trump and continues to deny support for Mr. Trump. And basically, he's talking about people's faith, people's belief that the office is going to make the man. That it is true, while it is true, that Trump's behavior up to this point has not really been presidential. There's a hope, a faith in the minds of many people that the responsibilities of the office are going to have an impact on the man to the point that he's going to become or begin to operate within moral constraints. In other words, he's going to be put on the straight and narrow by the very responsibility of the office to which he's been elected. Waldman's position is there's nothing in his behavior at this point, even through the first few days of his standing as president, to indicate that any of that is going to happen. He goes back to the writings of C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis's point that there has never been a man who did not feel constrained by morality for what he did, that was willing to do what he wanted to do because he felt he could do it, and that morality or moral constraints didn't really enter into the picture at all. C.S. Lewis's position is there's never been anybody who acted that way, who changed, who once they got into government began to govern benevolently. That kind of change doesn't happen, C.S. Lewis said. Peter Wehner, who writes this article on Donald Trump, says the same thing. That people are whistling Dixie, as it were, if they think that the presidency itself is going to cause Donald Trump to begin acting in ways that he never acted before. Morality hasn't stopped him before, Wehner says. There's nothing to indicate up to this point that this office is going to do that either. And this quote we read yesterday, and I think with this quote we can probably begin to think about taking our break if we're moving towards the very top of our first hour. I think we're at 58 minutes after the hour. So let me share this quote with you once again, and we'll use this as an opportunity to take our break, and then we'll come back in our second hour and we'll deal with yet another issue. And the issue I'd like to deal with is the issue of freedom of the press. Peter Wehner makes the following statement in this particular article. The easy part, the transition to power, is over. The hard part begins now. So this concern arises. When President Trump is buffeted by events, when hard times hit, when critics arise, when other politicians and world leaders do not bend to his will, pernicious things will happen. Rather than try to address the alienation and anger that exists in America, he will amplify them. He'll create yet more conspiracy theories. He'll also go in search of enemies, the press, the opposition party, other nations, even Republican leaders, in order to create diversions that inflame his most loyal supporters. And when he locates his targets, he'll do what has become second nature to him, which is to try to delegitimize and destroy them. What's different now is that the additional awesome power of the presidency at his disposal. Wehner's conclusion, then, is that there's nothing to indicate that moral constraints, which have never been important to him before, would suddenly become important to him now. And he points out that C.S. Lewis has written that throughout history, that's never happened. People that have not felt constrained by the limits of right and wrong, good and bad, never change their behavior when they get into positions of political power. The way they lived before has always been symptomatic of the way they'll behave in office. Wehner's position is, we really are blowing smoke if we believe that this situation is going to be any different. Pretty frightening. Pretty frightening. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We've just reached the top of the hour. We're right on the top of the hour, first hour, and we'll be back for our second one. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and I know that Agnes has some music to share with us, and I invite you to stay tuned. We're going to take a short break, but it won't be long. Thank you.
Brilliant show, Bill.
Thank you, Agnes. I appreciate it. This is a tough one. I just texted Agnes during the break and told her this stuff is so tough to deal with because it's so disturbing. It kind of violates everything we've been taught, everything we've been raised to believe about government, about the relationship between government and people, about the issue of respect between one person and another, between issues that we usually associate with basic human decency. All of this stuff just renders you almost speechless. And I think that's what's happening in a lot of cases. And I think it's going to take a while before people are able to respond positively to some of this stuff. And again, I have to take exception to the fact that hundreds of thousands of people did last Saturday. And unfortunately, I don't know. I mean, you could blame the administration, or you could give the administration credit for being so shrewd, or you can blame the media for its naivete, or for the degree to which it kind of seems to fall into line with what's best for this particular president. But be that as it may, wherever you assign responsibility, the fact of the matter is that the thrust of that march last Saturday was pretty much dissipated. And it's unfortunate. But I think it'll be back. And I just think it's going to take time for other people to really get on board with some of the things that are happening here. What made that particular movement possible was Trump's behavior in one particular area, area. And it made it possible for a lot of women to put aside particular issues that they had, which were different for others, and all begin to rally around that one issue, which is the dehumanization, the inhuman way that he spoke about and to women. I think it's a little bit disconcerting, but I think it's also important to recognize as well that there's one group of women, namely the people involved in the Right to Life movement, who really didn't participate in Saturday's march because the argument was that they weren't allowed to. And the issue is whether, in fact, people can get around that issue. I think that speaks to the seriousness of that issue and why it ought not to be a matter of political debate. I think that kind of reinforces James Madison's concern that you don't take these very personal issues and make them matters of political discussion and debate. because when you do, you create divisions between peoples, which are very difficult to overcome. And if the purpose of your government, and that's really what this one is about, is to find ways that people can come together and cooperate and solve problems together by focusing on the things they agree with, then those emotional, conscience-driven issues, like abortion, like right to life, these other things, become very divisive when they become part of the political dialogue. And I think this particular rift, if you will, that prevented that group from participating in the Women's March on Saturday kind of reinforces that point of view. Welcome to the second hour of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. If you are just joining us, we welcome you to this second hour of today's program. And if you've been with us through the entire program, I appreciate that, and I thank you for staying tuned with us. If you are just joining us, we've been going through a number of issues. We've talked about just the range and variety of issues that seem to be surfacing in the first few days of the Trump presidency. One of the themes we talked about was the issue of constitutionality. And for the last portion of our first hour, we focused on a lawsuit that has been filed. It was filed Monday against Donald Trump for violation of the Constitution's emolument clause because of the degree to which he is indirectly accepting money from foreign entities in his hotels, on his golf courses, in his lease agreements, in his credit arrangements with banks that are affiliated with foreign governments, that all of these things are clear violations of the emoluments clause. And there is a group called Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington that has stepped forward as plaintiff in this particular case. The case, of course, is going to be determined by whether, in fact, this particular group is deemed to even have been able to file the suit, whether, in fact, it can demonstrate a degree of personal harm that is necessary in order to be the plaintiff in a case like this. The attorneys that are advising this group claim that this group can meet that requirement. We'll see, because that's clearly the basis on which supporters, legal supporters of Mr. Trump, are going to challenge the validity of the lawsuit. We do invite you to share with us your thoughts on this or any of the other items we've been talking about and we will be talking about. I think the one that we'll be getting to next is the issue of freedom of the press and the First Amendment. We have a phone number, and it's there for you for the purpose of giving you access to coming on the air and sharing your thoughts with all of us. The phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate that way, is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906, all one word, lowercase, at gmail.com. And then finally, I encourage you to visit our Facebook page. Go to Facebook and in the search box, type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will have access to our Facebook page. And the most recent posting on it, which is one that I put there earlier today, deals with this issue of freedom of the press. Let me basically make a couple of points about this particular issue and why it's so important. And of course, what we're talking about is the hostile relationship which has surfaced, which existed through the campaign itself, but has surfaced during the first few days of the Trump presidency. Mr. Trump, as we all know, has made reference to the fact that members of the press, reporters, tend to be some of the most dishonest people in the world, he has said. He has belittled media organizations. He's belittled specific individuals in those organizations. He's denied certain elements of the media that have taken issue with him. He's denied them access to him, to his campaign, and now to his administration. During the latter part of his campaign, if you remember, he barred the Washington Post from his media sessions. He refused in his first session with the media to recognize CNN because they had chosen to support the BuzzFeed release of the private dossier on Mr. Trump and his relationships with and in Russia. Trump argued that all of it was false. It was full of falsehoods and mistakes and personal attacks. CNN chose to publish a 2-page summary of the dossier, of the 35-page dossier. As a result of that, Mr. Trump accused CNN of participating in what he called fake news. He refused to recognize Jim Acosta, who's CNN's reporter, White House reporter, to ask a question. And you may remember that Jim Acosta was screaming for the right to ask a question, especially since the president has directly attacked CNN. And President Trump made the comment that he was not going to allow CNN to ask a question because they were involved in, again, what he called fake news. We've talked about this issue on and off again over the last couple of days. But the fact of the matter is we really haven't talked about the issues that it raises. And that is the legitimacy of the media, of the press, and the right of the press to fulfill its responsibilities under the Constitution of the United States. And that's really what we're about here at the Virtual Center, is issues about and related to the Constitution itself. A bit of background. The right to freedom of the press is included in the First Amendment to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. If you remember, the freedoms addressed in the First Amendment are freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly. What's important to realize is that all 4 of those freedoms are directly related to, are pertinent to, the functioning of Republican government in America. It's important to recognize this. It's important to mention it because over time, this particular reality has been lost. Our young people, our K through 12 education systems have been largely responsible for this, but so also has the media. There's a general impression amongst the general public that First Amendment freedoms are primarily there because the founders were committed to the idea of individual freedom, and that they set out in the Bill of Rights to target particular freedoms which every human being had a right to. In other words, the general thinking is that these rights are really tantamount to what Jefferson referred to as unalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence. The fact of the matter is they are not. The fact of the matter is the rights in the Constitution of the United States are in no way what Locke called natural rights, or what Jefferson called unalienable rights. Jefferson's unalienable rights, he stated in the Declaration of Independence, were rights individuals receive from the Creator. In other words, they were human rights that people had because they were alive, because they were human beings, and as such, they were born with certain rights that they had been given only by God. These are not rights that were given by government. These are rights that people had before governments were even created, when God created man. Those are unalienable rights, what John Locke called natural rights. The rights articulated in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution of the United States, do not fulfill the requirements of unalienable rights. These are rights which are specifically mentioned in the Constitution of the United States. They are they are there as part of the frame of government. They are civil rights. They are rights that you are entitled to as a citizen of this republic. But there's something else. While their existence benefits individualism, benefits individual citizens themselves, it's important to recognize that they are rights vital, critical to the operation of this republic. What I'm suggesting is that in the mind of the founders, free speech was political speech. It was not the right to say whatever you wanted to anybody about whatever you wanted to talk about. That wasn't it at all. The idea of freedom of speech was based on the idea that in the free exchange, the marketplace of ideas, the only way to arrive at truth was through the free exchange of ideas. And in order to make sure that that exchange of ideas happened, you had to protect people's rights to speak, to publish. So freedom of the press, freedom of speech, the freedom to assemble with others in order to discuss and debate issues was a fundamental principle of this republic. If popular government in this republic was to be successful, then those rights had to be protected. That's an important consideration because it's fallen through the cracks. People have ceased to think about or recognize or acknowledge that particular aspect of the First Amendment and have assumed instead that these really are unalienable rights, the kind that Jefferson talked about in the Declaration. They are not. So since they are civic rights, these are civic freedoms, and since they come directly from the Constitution of the United States, then it's important to recognize that it is to the benefit of that Constitution, to the benefit of the United States, that these freedoms are mentioned and are addressed. Now we need to go back to another reality of the founding period. And that is that the initial author of the Constitution, James Madison, who, if you remember, wrote the Virginia Plan, which was the first draft of the Constitution before it was extensively amended in the Constitutional Convention, Madison and many of the other supporters of the Constitution did not believe that a Bill of Rights was necessary as part of the Constitution. They believed that many of the states contained bills of rights within their state constitutions, and that freedoms like freedom of the press and freedom of religion and freedom of assembly and freedom of speech were protected in state constitutions. And this was a popular government, a people's government, and they didn't believe that the Constitution required a Bill of Rights in order to be viable. But we know that the absence of a Bill of Rights in the Constitution threatened its very ratification. We know that most of the leading opponents of the Constitution, the Patrick Henrys and the others, pointed to the absence of a Bill of Rights as a reason to not ratify it, and indeed threatened to call a second constitutional convention in order to consider amendments to the Constitution in order to supplement the document with a Bill of Rights. It was in order to prevent the calling of that second convention that Madison and the other leading supporters of the Constitution finally acknowledged the willingness to accept a Bill of Rights. But in order to avoid the second convention, Madison committed the first Congress under the new Constitution to make it a priority, a first order of business, to undertake the drafting and the submission to the states of a Bill of Rights. So it's important to recognize that the founders didn't really believe that a Bill of Rights was necessary. In other words, they didn't believe, and we're focusing principally here on the freedom of the press issue, they didn't believe that it was necessary to specify the right or the freedom of the press within the Constitution initially. But once they accepted the credibility and the viability of a Bill of Rights, then they insisted that these freedoms become a part of that Bill of Rights. And the reason they are there is because the Republican structure of government, the Republican government that the Constitution created, absolutely required these rights if popular government was to work. The freedom of the press had to be protected because it was the press that provided the people with the kind of information, the kind of knowledge they needed in order to operate and function as informed citizens. Madison in 1822, made the very famous statement that a popular government can become either a farce or a tragedy or both, unless people can be sure that they have access to the kinds of information they need in order to hold their elected officials accountable. Freedom of the press is a critical ingredient to the operation of this republic. What that means is that this kerfuffle, this back and forth vindictiveness between the media and the president, goes way beyond the people involved. It literally affects the vitality and the validity of this political system. The concern among many is that the right of the media, the idea of the free press, can be permanently harmed by the President of the United States. And just today, in this morning's New York Times, 2 law professors addressed this issue in an important op-ed piece. Entitled, quote, "Don't expect the First Amendment to protect the media," unquote. Many people believe, these 2 law professors argued, the 2 professors I'm talking about are Ronell Anderson Jones and Sonia R. West. One is with George Washington University, I believe, and the other one, I believe, is with Vanderbilt. But anyway, law schools. But their arguments are that while many people can take solace, or think they can take solace, in the fact that because freedom of the press is in the First Amendment to the Constitution, therefore, there's nothing that the president or his attacks on the media can do about it. It's written into the Constitution. And what they point out is that that's not indeed true. That the fact of the matter is there really are 4 specific protections or defenses that First Amendment freedoms have because they are parts of the First Amendment. Specifically, there's the fact that the media's financial or fiscal power, its fiscal influence, the fact that the media is so significant financially in the society, means that their interests, its interests, the media's interests, are protected. Many people believe that the financial strength of newspapers and media outlets guarantees that the First Amendment will be protected. Another thing that many people believe is that the general public's commitment to the Constitution and commitment to the idea of a freedom of the press will protect it. In other words, the recognition of a freedom of a free press means that the public is on its side. The third thing is that over the years, the media focused on developing positive relationships with individuals and groups within government. The media had its friends, had its advisors, its confidants, its sources. And those kinds of positive relationships would help make freedom of the press safe. And finally, the courts. Judges would be sympathetic, primarily because their principal job is to interpret the Constitution of the United States and the importance of its provisions. So the argument was that there are these 4 major areas that we could depend on to make sure that freedom of the press is not jeopardized, no matter how severely it's attacked by the Trump administration. These authors then proceed to point out that over the years, every one of these protections has been weakened. That the media has become so competitive amongst itself that you can't rely on its strength, on its financial strength. That in effect, the competitive nature of free enterprise, the fact that media outlets have become businesses, big businesses, that are vulnerable to regulation by government, suggests that more often than not, that protection is not there. That there is just as likely to be hostile relationships between the media and government as anything else. Their priority, therefore, is not going to be freedom of the press at all, but financial advantage over their competitors. The second defense is the goodwill of the people. The fact that the people support the media, the press. That was true. In fact, they point out in their article that in the 1970s, 3/4 of the American people surveyed reported that they trusted the news media. But that trust has disintegrated. Today, for example, the media's ratings in public opinion polls is about as low as it's ever been. People have become very distrustful of the media. The other thing is that the existence of social media, like Twitter and the president's use of it, means that the president can directly relate to people. People don't need to depend on the media anymore to get their information. They can get it directly from the source. All of these things have contributed to weakening public support for the media. And then finally, the issue of good relationships between government and certain government officials and the media. That can't be relied upon either. As far as the courts are concerned, the courts have not made, these two attorneys point out, the courts have not made a significant ruling related to freedom of the press in more than a decade. Lower courts oftentimes take issue with the political positions of newspapers and media outlets in their own districts. The fact of the matter is some media outlets, newspapers, are beginning to go out of business for financial reasons. Media outlets, media companies have become so competitive with each other for financial reasons that they're really not able to maintain the kind of journalism that the First Amendment implies. If you watch local television, like we all do, the local news media, for example, with the exception of our largest cities, most small towns, small media newspapers and TV stations, for example, can't afford to hire the kind of journalists who will go out there and dig news. For the most part, what the local media reports on the local news is what they are given. They become almost advertisers for government rather than investigators of government. They don't have the resources to do the kind of investigative journalism that the First Amendment implies that a free press must do in a republic. And so the fact of the matter is, all of the assumed protections of the First Amendment right to freedom of the press have become weaker in recent years than many people recognize or assume that they are. The one thing that hasn't is the tradition of a free press, is people's faith in the role of the press and in the role of the media. That idea that the media is always there, and since free press is part of the Constitution of the United States, at least the Bill of Rights, that it always will be there. That kind of tradition is the last vestige of protection that this particular First Amendment freedom has. And it's the tradition that Trump's attacks are aimed at. What the president is saying is that the media can't be trusted, that the media lies, that the media puts out fake news, that the media takes positions which are unfair, if not illegal, that the media has its own agenda, and that the people can't trust what they read in the papers or hear on the radio or on television. And what Donald Trump is saying is that's why I can basically put the straight facts out in Twitter. People don't need the media anymore. They can depend directly on me. In a sense, what that means is that these attacks from the White House on the credibility of the media really threaten the last vestige of protection that the First Amendment freedom of the press provides. The point, then, of this particular article is that these attacks on the credibility of the media are important. They are real. They have long-range implications, and they could do serious damage to the functioning of this government. But it also means that the media has responsibilities as well. It's interesting to point out that the White House, Sean Spicer, in press conferences, has been emphasizing the media's responsibility to report the truth, to report facts, and not fake news. So the implication here is that the White House is attacking the media because it's not living up to its responsibilities under the First Amendment either. All of this seems to me to come down to the importance of a free press, to people's recognition of the importance of a free press. And they need to recognize it and to demand accountability. Accountability of government to the people who live under it, yes. But accountability of the media to fulfill its role as envisioned by the founders when the First Amendment was first drafted. The media has a responsibility to not allow itself to be the spokesman or the mouthpiece of government. The media does not exist merely to bring the government's position on issues to the people. Its job is not to sell government programs and policies to the general public. Its job is to basically inform the public as to what they are, why they're there, what their intent is. And if there's things wrong with them, it's the responsibility of the media to point that out. That's the only way that people, citizens, can know what their government is doing or not doing. So the media has responsibilities also. Of course, the answer to this question, I believe, is in the way we educate our young, the way we teach the Constitution of the United States in our schools. Up to this point, I don't believe we've done it. In fact, I had a close friend today make the comment, it's really tough to argue under the circumstances, but he made the comment that if our public education system was doing what it's supposed to do, then Donald Trump wouldn't be president of the United States. I think we need to think about that one for a moment. But it seems to me we need to recognize the importance of freedoms of speech, press, religion, and the rest of it as they pertain to the viability of the society we live in. We're not talking here about natural, unalienable rights of citizens inherited from their creator. We're not talking about human rights over and above government. We're talking in these particular issues about civic rights that are part of the political fabric and are necessary in order for government to function. We've got to begin to educate our young people so that they understand and know that. Because since they don't know much about it at all, they're obviously vulnerable to being persuaded by the ability of one side or the other to make its case effectively. In other words, they're being persuaded by the power of dialogue rather than the ability to know and understand fact, evidence. And that, it seems to me, is what has to happen. That's an important issue. And I hope, I trust that we've done something positive with it, because I really believe that it's an important one. We've moved beyond 45 minutes after the hour. So we're down to, the last 10, 11, 12 minutes, if you will, of our program. Can I take this last portion of our time left today to address yet another issue that I hate to let go, because by the time we get back together again next week, it'll have become a week old. I think it's too important to allow that to happen. This is a posting that I put on Facebook some time ago. This is an article that appeared, I believe I put it in the paper, this appeared in the paper yesterday. The date that I have on the article from the New York Times is January 24th. And the title of the article is The Banal Belligerence of Donald Trump. Its author is a regular columnist of the New York Times, Roger Cohen. This is important. It's probably too important to be covered adequately in the time we've got left. But let me alert you to the importance of this article. If you go to our Facebook page and you look for the posting that begins with the link to this particular article, The Banal Belligerence of Donald Trump by Roger Cohen, I think it's a read that would be well worth your while. Roger Cohen gets into a very sensitive issue here, especially sensitive in the divisions between supporters of President Trump and his critics. And that is the tendency of critics of Donald Trump to make allusions which suggest that much of what Donald Trump is doing, much of the behavior that he's exhibiting, smacks of the 1930s in Nazi Germany. The implication of that connection, of course, is that Donald Trump is moving in the same directions of dictatorship that Adolf Hitler did. Roger Cohen gets into this issue. But the thing about the article that I think we need to really focus on is that he appreciates how sensitive and how dangerous this is. Because in this article, he's not willing to basically say that what Trump is doing is symptomatic of what Hitler did. But what he is able to say, and this is the strength of the article, is that if you look at the way the people are responding to Donald Trump, and you compare it to the way that the people of Germany responded to Adolf Hitler at the time, you can't help but begin to realize that the circumstances are similar and that the people's response is similar as a result. He needs to make that connection, but at the same time, he's very sensitive to how volatile and explosive making that connection can be. He basically points out that if you consider a defeated German army going back at the end of World War I to the homeland, to Germany, as defeated, as a defeated army, a defeated nation in 1918, and you compare it with America's reaction to the terrorist attacks in 9/11 in September of 2001, you can begin to appreciate that people's reactions in those two circumstances are quite similar. And what he does is to ask us to go 16 years beyond the event to look at what public reaction to it has become. Obviously, 16 years is an important number, because his point is we've come 16 years from the 9/11 attacks to the election of Donald Trump. And if you go 16 years from the end of World War I into the 1930s, into 1934, you come to the election of Adolf Hitler as Führer. People responded to the same kinds of circumstances in the same way 3/4 of a century ago as they are responding now. The conclusion being that the circumstances which produced Adolf Hitler in the 1930s are the same kinds of psychological circumstances that have produced Donald Trump now. And then he includes what I think is the relevant paragraph in this particular article, and I want to make sure that I share this one with you because I think it says a lot. Specifically, he's talking about what has happened in the first few days of the Donald Trump presidency and what it looks like in the context of the scenario that he has sketched out in this particular article. Then he points out some of the things that Donald Trump has said and done in the first few days of his presidency. And this is a quote. To say, as Trump did, that the elected representatives of American democracy are worthless and that the people are everything is to lay the foundations of totalitarianism. Donald Trump has done that. He has basically argued in his inaugural that our elected officials, he didn't specify Democrats or Republicans, he's talking about both. He's talking about the people that were sitting right behind him on the stage. Basically saying to the American people that your elected officials have let you down, that they're worthless, and that all you can trust in is me. By suggesting then that the elected representatives of American democracy are worthless and that the people are everything, which is what he said in his inaugural, is to lay the foundations of totalitarianism. It is to say that democratic institutions are irrelevant, and all that counts is the great leader and the masses of people he arouses. To speak of American carnage is to deploy the dangerous lexicon of blood, soil, and nation. To boast of a historic movement, the likes of which the world has never seen before, is to recall the darkest clarion calls of nationalist dictators. To exalt protectionism is to risk a return to a world of barriers and confrontations. To utter falsehood after falsehood, directly or through a spokesman, is to foster the disorientation that makes crowds susceptible to the delusions of the strong man. What he is pointing out is that the actions that Donald Trump has taken in the first few days of his administration validate the connection, the comparison between 16 years after the 9/11 attacks and people's reaction to it, as opposed to the German people's reaction to Adolf Hitler 16 years after the defeat of the German army in World War I. Let me close that analogy with this one, which I found very telling. This is a connection made by Charles Blau in Monday's New York Times, talking about the very same thing, the elements within the inaugural speech that Donald Trump delivered on last Friday. And he points out that portions of this speech sounded very familiar to a speech delivered by the villain Bane in the Batman movie, The Dark Knight Rises. Bane also promised, quote, "We take Gotham from the corrupt, the rich, the oppressors of generations who have kept you down with mists of opportunity, and we give it back to you, the people," unquote. And of course, the Batman movie points out that that statement is followed by plunging Gotham into chaos. The analogies which define the modern definition of populism that we see in Roger Cohen's article in yesterday's New York Times and in Charles Blau's Monday piece, a throwback to the Batman movie and the speech of the villain, Bane, in that movie are eerie. They are frightening. It's not a very high note on which to end our program, our week's programming here at the Virtual Center. But I think it's telling, and I think it suggests that we all need to be about our business, our political business, as citizens of this republic. We're at 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for tuning in to today's program. I hope that you have a wonderful evening. It's a beautiful day outside here in Appalachia. I hope you have a great day and that you have a great rest of the week. We'll be back together with you, everything working out, the Lord willing, next Monday at our regular time. For the Virtual Center, for the Head On Radio Network, Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the rest, thank you so much. Be kind to each other. Be safe. And once again, thank you.